In order to have a powerful fundraising proposition, you need tension. If you think about if you have a story, if you tell a story without any conflict or any tension, that story will feel pretty flat, pretty uninspiring. The greater the tension, the greater the engagement. So what seems to happen within fundraising is when we move away from the tension of the left hemisphere, you play to fear, anxiety to drive the motivation, is that we tend to soften the tension and we create weaker fundraising propositions. So that's the problem when we move to the ethical framework within the marketing paradigm. So in order to avoid that, we need to look at what are the tension states of the right hemisphere and how do we work with them? Because if we're moving away from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere tension states, from extrinsic to intrinsic, then we need to work with a different set of tension criteria. So what do they look like and how do we work with them? And I have to say from the start that when we're working with the right hemisphere, a lot of this stuff doesn't seem logical. That's because we are in a left hemisphere culture. We think pretty much everything through our left hemisphere. We rationalize through our left hemisphere. We think reality is best understood from our left hemisphere. So therefore, anything that emerges from the right hemisphere, we kind of looks a bit odd or strange, and we tend to reject it outright. But bear with me, just play along and see how these two different tension states can give us some really valuable insights into creating really powerful fundraising propositions that lead to long-term change. So the left hemisphere likes to create order. It likes to avoid suffering at all costs. It doesn't know what to do with suffering, so it tries to get rid of it. And therefore, in order to engage motivation with the left hemisphere, to manipulate the left hemisphere into doing something, you create suffering, you create anxiety, and show a way to take away that anxiety. So this is the tension of opposites. So the left hemisphere likes to get rid of things and find ways of getting So left hemisphere likes to get rid of things. So it has two kind of tension states. You have negative and positive. So negative, extrinsic tension is classic marketing, which we're all familiar with and we do all the time, is you create anxiety and you offer a magic solution. And we do that in climate communications. We create eco-anxiety, so how the world is falling apart, and then sign up to our campaign as a magic solution. So it's the same model. It works in terms of getting people to sign up to your campaign, but it creates long-term psychological problems in terms of once you create anxiety, it leads to long-term kind of apathy, leads to negative thoughts. And if you want to research the long-term effects of anxiety, go ahead. It's a terrible way to create long-term motivation. So the tension of opposites, when we use an extrinsic motivation, it's very good for short-term rewards, terrible for long-term behavioral change. Or we can create positive extrinsic tension, where we offer reward or pleasure. So this might be it's the promise of winning a raffle prize in our fundraising propositions, or the suggestion that if you come along to a fun run, you're going to have fun. So use fun as a motivation proposition. So the idea that you give a reward or you offer pleasure is the positive extrinsic tension. So either you use anxiety or fear, or you use its reward or pleasure. So these are your kind of two up and down kind of tensions you use for motivation. But when we move to the right hemisphere, it works in a very different way. It doesn't play to anxiety or fear, or doesn't seek reward or pleasure. In fact, it seeks self-transcendence, which is kind of a hard concept to get your head around, because we live in such a consumeristic, materialistic culture that we tend to think the only thing that drives motivation is reward or pleasure, or it is to avoid anxiety. So the right hemisphere likes to bring things together, to integrate oppositions. And this takes a time to kind of unpack. But when we tell stories, the right hemisphere is drawn to stories that have conflict. So think about this a second. I'll give you the Harry Potter example as a simple one. If you read the books of Harry Potter, especially as a young child, some of the scenes in there are awful. We have a child being almost sacrificed and tortured. You have death. You have some terrible scenes in there which are quite traumatic. But somehow we are drawn to those scenes and we're enriched by those moments. So when we have great suffering, encountering great love, and that's what happens in storytelling, where you have the tension of suffering and love colliding together, that creates a resonance. And the right hemisphere is drawn by that resonance. And that's why we're drawn by stories. We need to hear stories. We need to have drama. And all stories have to have a happy ending. When a story doesn't have that happy ending, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't sit comfortably. Even though in real life, there is no happy ending. It's usually the bad guys usually do win. The ones who have power usually get their way. But in stories, we have to have the story of the underdog winning or succeeding, or we have to have stories of redemption where everything comes together at the end. These stories resonate not because they reflect reality, but they are working with the deep psychological drivers that are needed for us to awaken certain values. So the integration of opposites is really important to the right hemisphere. So in order to integrate opposites, you need to connect your audience to a deeper purpose. So move away from novelty, it's kind of shiny ways to attract people, to give money to your organization, and move more towards kind of meaningful and purpose-driven kind of fundraising propositions. What does this mean? How do we create connection, kind of bring people into the story that they are part of it, and a more deeper way of engaging them? Or you can use negative intrinsic tension, where we show how to transcend suffering. And you see this in almost all religions and kind of wisdom narratives, as well as ancient cultures, indigenous cultures today, that when they tell stories, the stories aren't all happy, shiny, and all lovely. They all deal with suffering in some way. They all deal with the tension of how do we make sense of suffering. In many ways, you could say all myth is a way to understand suffering. And so therefore, when we move more towards storytelling, more towards kind of mythic language, we tend to bring together the two opposites of love and suffering. And these are very broad categories, and they can be expanded into light and darkness, blindness and seeing. There's a whole range of storytelling narratives that can express this integration of opposites. So it's not about talking about suffering in your communications. It's taking people into a journey where they experience the narrative, the story for themselves, and in that experience they are transformed. And in that transformation, certain values are awakened, and these are intrinsic values. Intrinsic values happen when you create this integration of opposites, this stress state. So values don't emerge by pointing to them. They don't emerge when we say we need to take care of the environment, which is an extrinsic motivation that we should do, take care of the environment. We ought to or should do, tackle global poverty or work towards social justice. That's all extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic values happen when you have this collision of opposites, where something occurs at the deep psyche, and then when these two opposites occur, something new emerges. So when we look at the integration of opposites, it really is, to put it in a more practical way, about how do we bring our audiences into a story. Now, back to your Harry Potter storytelling. It's that when you're reading a book, you get transported into the story. And sometimes when you're so engrossed in a story, you forget about your surroundings and what's going on around you. And you're actually in that place there and then, almost feeling what the characters in the story are feeling. And it's a very, very powerful effect. And you can read a story and increase your heart rates, increase your physical reaction, and it can have a profound long-term effect on you. So storytelling is a great way of bringing people into the story and transporting them there, and working with their emotions, and also working with their values and their sense of purpose. There's so much you could do within storytelling. But when we look at storytelling within the charity sector, most of what happens in terms of storytelling it's not really storytelling. It's not doing any of that. It's more about telling the stories of the people that we're trying to help. We might talk about Abdul, who has to walk 5 miles every day to collect wood for his family. And we might have a quote from Abdul who says, "Life is hard." This is more like a report. It's more like the outside eye looking in on the situation. And this is storytelling within a marketing paradigm, is that we tell stories in order to create a motivation for people to give. And these stories can feel very flat, one-dimensional, and it's the same story again and again. We might change from Abdul to another country, to somewhere in Mozambique, or we might change it to somewhere in Nicaragua, but it's the same story. The who, what, where, when, why might change, but it's still the same meta-narrative. It's still the same marketing message that's being portrayed in those stories. So we don't transport people into the stories like proper storytelling does, and we don't really tend to make people feel and taste the dust in the air when we're talking about what life is like in a refugee camp. We tend to talk about it as a reporter, as a news reporter. It's offering that information, because the idea, back to that triangle, that once we have this information about this family stuck in a refugee camp, that we are much more likely to give. The behaviour will come out. Once we know how bad the refugee camp is, we'll then give as a result. We're back to that kind of pyramid thinking again. So how do we bring people into the story and feel part of it and engage with it? And this is where the integration of opposites is. How do we, and this is going to sound strange at first, but work with me, how do you make your audience suffer well? And if you think about it, most storytelling does exactly that. It makes your audience feel. It makes them suffer what your character in the story is suffering. And when redemption comes at the end, you, as the reader, feel the great joy that your character also feels. So how do we do those sorts of techniques in our storytelling, and how do we use that in our fundraising propositions? So we can see the tension of opposites are very different. One is around avoid suffering. The second is how do we transcend suffering? And in order to transcend suffering, we need to include it, take people into suffering in order that they are transformed and they transcend out of it. And that is what storytelling is trying to, that's what storytelling does do. So how do we move more towards a storytelling paradigm in order to drive the motivation to give to our organizations? So therefore, we need to look at a new motivation model using insights from neuropsychology to see how we can create long-term behavioral change by taking our audiences up to the higher stages of motivation. And this next part, I think, offers some incredible insight, which has huge implications for everything we do. So in the next section, we'll be looking at a new motivation model.